This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune. In this podcast, we'll investigate, let's say, system of or the body of ideas that had their inception historically in 19th century Germany, from the early to mid 19th century, and are summed up in usually under the term Young Hegelianism, or the ideas of so-called Young Hegelians or left Hegelians. Now, this term designates a group of thinkers, German thinkers, most of them professors. The most important among them, originally theologians, which is very important, as we shall see, and they are, of course, a kind of successors, or they saw themselves like such successors of Hegel and interprets of Hegel philosophy in a radical way. The reason why they call them left Hegelians sometimes is a political one, in the sense that their interpretation of Hegel was to the left, but some of them were quite rightist in their outlook, of course, by the criteria of Germany of that time. That was still not a unified state, and they mostly, if not exclusively, acted in Prussia, centered, of course, in Berlin. That was one of those German states, and this was the place where Hegel was considered to be official Staatsphilosoph, state philosopher, that was sanctioned. His philosophy was sanctioned by the state. And they were people who in a sense, radicalized this philosophy in the direction of some kind of revolution. That is to say, in the sense of taking Hegel's philosophy as a mean of not accepting the world or explaining the world, but as radically changing it. Of course, those in the know already see that this is somewhat paraphrasing Karl Marx, who was also a young Hegelian, although he was not a philosopher or theologian. He was a lawyer by his education. He studied law, although his doctoral dissertation was in philosophy. But that was quite normal at that time, because it was a time of an attempt of creating one really universal university where you could you were able to work across sections of various sciences, and this was the very idea of Hegelian absolute science or philosophy or dialectics, that there is the common essence to all knowledge, and this common essence can be represented in concepts, and that university study in fact gives you an ability to indulge into this absolute science. So you can see how, for instance, heuristic sciences, the science of law, reflects philosophy, and vice versa. Now, left Hegelianism is, or young Hegelianism, had many now relatively still famous adherents. They were not so famous Europe-wide in their age, like Ludwig Feuerbach, or Max Stirner, or one of the, let's say, neglected young Hegelians, Bruno Bauer, on whom we'll speak a bit more, who was very influential on Marx. And there was David Strauss, a theologian. Both him and Bauer were theologians. that made such influence, especially on German culture, that there can be traced a whole lineage of 20th century first half Germany to them. In my opinion, and in opinion on better authorities on Germany than me, like Thomas Mann, who in his novel Dr. Faustus, in fact, traces this mentality, the development of this mentality from highest form of idealism to the catastrophe of Nazism. Dr. Faustus is a novel I would warmly recommend for everybody to consider reading. It's really excellent. Now, why this theology segment? Why are we taking theology to be so important in this context? Well, in this podcast, we'll try to demonstrate a hypothesis. That is to say, we'll try to put forward a hypothesis. We can't really demonstrate it satisfactorily in such short notice, that modern or contemporary left radicals, that is, in my opinion, more and more all left you can imagine, political and philosophical, ideological left, is rooted in theological problems. An attempt to solve theological problems as people in Germany in Prussia of 19th century seen them. The way the Hegel put them forward and the way the Young Hegelians attempted to solve them. When I say I cannot demonstrate it here, doesn't mean that it is not very much demonstrable when you start comparing, reading really the works of these people. To explain what this means, we have to understand what theology was for these people. They were, for instance, the founders of what is later dubbed classical German idealism, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, as it is understood that there are three main representatives and substantial thinkers of this movement, of this in history of philosophy. They were all theologians. And people that came after them, even those left Hegelians, radicals, were also theologians, at least some of the most important among them. Well, theology was the science for them that has a positive object, not subject, object, and its object is God. And and everything that pertains to God. And in Hegel's mind, theology in this sense is in fact philosophy, and more to the point academic philosophy, because among other things, academic philosophy became academic with those Germans. That is to say, at that time, it was the first time probably in history where outside of Catholic Church you could have PhD, as Americans call it now, doctorate in philosophy, and lecture on philosophy on secular university as a profession. Before that, philosophers were mostly gentlemen scientists, people that were independent of institutions. And one of those, and the black sheep of German philosophy of the age, of German idealism was Arthur Schopenhauer, who was the greatest enemy of them, of Hegel and others, and his remarks on Hegel are amongst the most poisonous and funniest in the history of philosophy. He absolutely despised him, and he was, for instance, typical, as the Germans say, Privatdozent, that is to say, the professor who has a right to hold lectures, but is not paid for them. But he was of independent means, and he lived as a gentleman scholar. doing his thing, and he was more in a vein of as philosophers were before this time. Anyway, theology is something that is in fact a department of the state. That is to say, the state in this context, a Prussian state, was a Christian Protestant state, where, in opinion of Hegel and Hegelians, the idea of Christianity, that is to say, the self-consciousness of the spirit, that is the essence of what Christianity is, came to fruition and to concretization in institutions. So institutions of state, you don't need a church outside of the state institutions that are imbibed with Christianity and that are not conformed by created on Christian principles as they saw them. So theologian would be a civil servant. And this is why the study of theology was understood as a quite normal thing for entrance into civil service, not like something a Catholic theologian would understand it, because there was nothing in this mentality. There is nothing transcendent about anything theology indulges with. Theology is secular. That is to say, because God manifested himself, let's say, absolutely in this world. I am simplifying, of course, and when you talk about Hegel, it's always simplifying, because among other things, he's so obscure that his adherents can always tell you, you missed something. But more or less, this was the rationale. And that is the reason why some of those people were theologians. The other thing is, virtually all of them were either explicit and aggressive atheists or implicit ones. So they were theologians, atheists. How is this possible? I mean, you have a mentality. What kind of mentality you have if you go study theology and you don't believe in God? So you don't believe in the existence of the object of your study. Well, I can say that I met that kind of people. There is a kind of people that like to do this for some reason. Naturally for destructive reasons. But this is a very strange thing. In the case of some of the young Hegelians I have in mind, specifically Bruno Bauer, it was implicit that this idea of God has nothing to do with the reality of God. It was the idea of freedom that theology indulges with. And at one point, or few points in stages, it dawned on these people that God is not enough, that God is not whom they thought he was. And the gist of all the problematics they took as their own was that God is in fact, and Christianity in particular, was a religion in general, was a product of alienation of man's self-consciousness. That is to say, inability, historical development that was conditioned by inability of man to understand that theology is in fact anthropology. This is a paraphrase. My last sentence is a paraphrase from Ludwig Feuerbach, who was one of those thinkers who carried with his Wesen des Christentum, The Essence of Christianity, his book that was significantly influential in these circles, where he came out with an idea that that human beings historically projected all of their best qualities to a transcendent nothing, that God is in fact a perfect human, Son of Man. One could say that human beings project into great beyond, because they are still not at the stage that they are capable of accepting themselves and love themselves properly. Now, Feuerbach, we won't go into Feuerbach here so much. It's not so interesting. A more interesting guy is Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer is not so famous. Everybody who's studying Young Hegelianism, of course, knows who he is, because he was a Marx mentor for some time, and like all people, Marx was on good terms with. At some point, they diverged, and Marx made a horrible scathing and a cruel criticism of both on personal and intellectual level. Marx was that kind of guy, but that was prevalent in psychology of those people, and I think it's not an accident. I'll try to explain why in due time. Bruno Bauer's idea was that what happens in Christianity is the absolute degradation of human being. Mind you, he's a theologian. He's a theologian that sang praises to Christianity, to Jesus, and so on and so forth. At one point, he comes to this. This is very interesting how this happens. How completely, absolutely abstract these people were. Everything was ideas for them. And those ideas had very little to do with grounding in reality. It's a very interesting thing. And he came with an idea. He was the first theologian in the West from antiquity, from the first debates between Christians and pagans, who came with an idea that Jesus never existed. This is Bruno Bauer. He came up with this idea. Before, he was inspired by very critical of David Strauss, who was his famous Leben Jesu, the Life of Jesus, the book that came out, first book that came out with an idea that Gospels were written as a kind of philosophical myths. That Jesus did exist, but the miracles ascribed to him never happened, never occurred, and that later community created these myths that nevertheless express the truth, because truth can be expressed in myth. And this is let us pause for a moment to explain where this comes from. This is the idea that sways the minds even to today. Incredibly so in theology, that somebody can think in this way. That is to say that things are not for instance, Life of Jesus is not literal, but it's a product of imagination, vastly product of imagination, and nevertheless that it is true. This is something that would be 100% inconceivable to people who created Gospels. I boldly posit. I think I don't have to explain myself too much why this is, but this was the climate of this post-German idealism period, when this was understood as completely natural. The reason is the assumption of self-consciousness as a substantial object of knowledge. Now, Bruno Bauer, who was more radical even than David Strauss, took this idea that self-consciousness, that is to say, ability to represent the truth, some being to represent the truth about itself, and represent the truth in the arts, institutions, religion, and so on, which are representations of truth. They are not identity of knowledge of truth, where truth is aware of itself. That's the holy grail of German idealism. This is possible only in philosophy, in pure intellect, as Hegel saw it, that thinks itself. and in this way participates in God. But this secularization of Aristotle's theology, the idea is that religion is a representation of Vorstellung, concrete representation, that is to say, when we say that we have a body of teaching, Christian art, and so on, those are altogether create a representation that is accurate. But the real, let us say, experience of God would be thinking in academic philosophical terms. Funny, but that was the idea. And this self-consciousness is the main object of their inquiry. And so, if self-consciousness of Christians created myths, those myths are true because the whole Christianity is a product of self-consciousness. That is to say, in some way, God worked through self-consciousness of people to manifest himself. The underlying idea is, of course, that God needs man, that God needs history, that God needs creation to manifest and observe himself in the end, which is something that is very peculiar to a certain what Orthodox Christian would call heresies. But this was rather normal at the time, and this is rather normal now in some circles that should know better, and it was very normal at the first half of 20th century and so on and so forth. You wouldn't believe how normal. But people very rarely go to the bare bones and anatomy of these ideas, and then they can remain and be stupefied by what they considered to be true, how perverted it is. Anyways, in this sense, for instance, through what they call Volksgeist, the people's spirit, the myths of the people somehow express the truth, and truth is always expressed historically. This is very important. It is processual. It is not eternity that reveals itself in history by its own will, but it is some kind of process always, so you can account for history. And so there is, when they say, for instance, they call the method critical method. You have this critical theology or critical history of Gospels. What they don't tell you is they rely, as all leftists do after them, their pupils, in fact, and descendants. When they say they have a critique of something, what they really mean is they have a critical theory of something, that is to say they have a dogma that they are trying to demonstrate through demolishing other dogmas. And so therefore it is not the case that they are without prejudices or without standpoints of their own, as they like to present themselves with the very word critique. No. They have presumption. And in this case, self-consciousness was a presumption. And Bruno Bauer was radical in the sense that he threw away the Hegelian concept of substance, because in Hegel, the idea is that substance has to be understood as subject. This means that substance is in itself. What is in itself? This is the being in general, as he said, being of the world, of everything conceivable, everything that can be experienced in the world. And on the other pole, you have subject, that is to say, consciousness. And the idea is that this consciousness, by becoming self-consciousness, becoming aware of itself, reflecting in itself through the series of mediations, it realizes that substance and itself are the same, that world I and the world are one thing. This is the idea. In Bruno Bauer, and this has an implications, it has a conservative political implication in the sense that everything is in the end understood as good, whereas Bruno Bauer was of the opinion that not only some things are not good, that nothing is good, and then nothing will be good until the last vestige of oppression is removed from this world. And this oppression, what it means by oppression is that self-consciousness is objectified, that it is not free in its subjectivity and in the exercise of its self-consciousness, and this exercise of self-consciousness over its expressions of freedom, law, morality, art, and creativity in general. And he considered Christianity as the foremost extremity of the disalienation of self-consciousness from itself, because it is the projection of the worst weaknesses of self-consciousness into Jenseits, as he would say, other side, and in institutions that are also understood as being on the other side, because one cannot change them. And in this way, enslavement, absolute enslavement of I. And this is the word they love, emancipation. No emancipation is possible until everything is emancipated. And in fact, this means complete destruction of Christianity, first intellectual, then if need be other ways. And abolition of religion, abolition of any kind of notion of that there is a God, that there is something transcendent, and so on and so forth, for the sake of the true origin of these ideas, that is the self-consciousness, self-conscious. Interestingly enough, this self-conscious for Bruno Bauer is always particular. It is either individual as a one man, it is individual as a class maybe, that's something that we have later in Marx, or as a people, for instance, with Volkgeist, the spirit of the people. Think Nazism. Now, to make these long-winded connections is something that needs volumes to demonstrate. But I'll just note this idea of self-consciousness that has to be individual, and national ethnic individuality in this thought is that kind of individuality, that is to say many in one, or individuality that is more than simple individual, but it is more like let's say unique individual that encompasses a lot in itself. And this is for instance folk. And with all those leftists, freedom-loving leftists, it was very normal later on with Engels and Marx, but especially Engels, the amateur geopolitician, to declare the whole peoples to be unworthy of existence because they are reactionary to revolution. And one of those is my own people, Serbs, Czechs, and Slavs in general. Ironically enough, the people that carried their fucking, I'm sorry for my language, communist revolution on their backs in the end. So you have this. Now, this is where ideas germinate, and you can understand ideas in themselves, which is very hard, and which few people, me excluded, can do. And you can understand ideas in their fruits. And the fruits of Young Hegelians were these radical ideologies of 20th century. I think that Young Hegelians are the nucleus from which this came forth. Some people, like for instance Karl Lewitz, German expert who wrote From Hegel to Nietzsche, History of German Spirit, who writes about this time. He understood them as extremely honest men that fought all their life for what they believed. I'm not sure that I would agree with this, but even if it is true, it doesn't matter. These are very destructive ideas. These are ideas of inverted word. world. And now, inverted world is something they, to wit, Bruno Bauer, accused the Christianity for. That Christianity is, in fact, inversion of the world. Now, mind you, I'm talking about theologian here. Think about it. This is theology. This is the man who was a public servant theologian. That is to say, he was under the state censorship, not church censorship. Under the state censorship, he was the guy who had to in a lecture about proofs of God's existence or whatnot, or necessity of Christian faith to imbibe and build the Prussian institutions. And all of a sudden, in a very short span of time, he just turns against it. This is very interesting. The relationship of these men. I know from my own student times, I was fascinated by the fact how easily they broke their friendships. This is something most historians of philosophy will not look into this, but it always caught my eye, because I cannot detach people and ideas, and I consider people far more important than ideas. Not principles. Idea and metaphysical principle are not the same thing, except in Plato, but Plato is as far from these people as a moon is from my living room. So this is completely different. This is apples and oranges. A fascinating thing is their instability in the sense, ontological sense, that they can turn about on a cue. And this is something I see even now in people, especially from USA, who have these YouTube channels and so on, and discover philosophy, theology, and so on. How quickly they turn about, they change confessions, they run from Protestant to Catholic, from Orthodox to Catholic, vice versa, or Muslim even, on a cue. The reason I think should lie in this direction. It is the identification of truth with the system of ideas that one holds, and this is a complete. In order to have this, you have to have a complete detachment from reality. Reality, in the sense, not being able to look at the cupboard and say it is a cupboard, but reality in the sense that of being in itself, of the principle in which we resolve our thinking and experience. It comes from this, the principle that is transcendental in medieval sense of what is first. And they simply, some people obviously simply don't have touch with this. I think the most people, common run of people have. They don't think on it that much, which is natural, and they frankly don't need to think on it much. You start to think on it when you try to defend it, I would say. But some people, a great number of people, does not have this grounding in reality, because if you don't have grounding, this is what happens. And this scattering enmity between people who were formerly friends, and changing of running into complete opposites and extremities. I mean, from theologian to extreme anti-theologian, while you still consider yourself theologian. That's such a ruined and fruitless life in the end. This is such a misfire of a human being. A theologian who enlisted to be theologian because his urge was not to believe. Can you imagine? But most of those people were precisely such. And Interesting, another thing to note is this enmity towards Christianity. So when you have, as I said, Marx and Engels were extremely, especially Marx, were extremely influenced by Bruno Bauer. And a good deal of ideas on religion in Marxism come from Bruno Bauer, although with different spin, with an idea that they are not product of self-consciousness that is somehow internally making this inversion, but really it is completely from the outside forces. That is to say, religion is an opium for the people. That's something that Bruno Bauer came with, not Marx, and it originates in Hegel's opinion on Eastern religions. It is not... It is something that would just disappear after the means of production were in the hands of proletariat and blah, 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 blah. Well, the idea that Marxism, for instance, can be reconciled with any kind of religion is a complete idiocy. It cannot, because it is a religion. The idea is that self-consciousness is God. It is the subject. It is the absolute subject. It is the seat of freedom, of happiness, of everything, and it has to be liberated from everything that is not itself. And for instance, and it's only the question what this subject in historical sense is. For instance, for Bruno Bauer, it could be some people or existing state or liberal state. For Marxists, it's a working class, not because they loved working class, they hated workers. And Marx, it is not insignificant to note that Marx was the opposite, the very opposite of worker. And the very opposite of cognoscere in economy. But this is not accidental, because the original problem is theological. He wants to abolish God. He wants the theology without God. And this is underlying all his critiques. And this cannot under no circumstances be reconciled with any kind of religion, especially of Christianity, because it inverts precisely Christianity. It wants to destroy it. It considers it inverted world. Inverted world means that Christianity is making a system of ideas that makes a conscious subject take things diametrically opposed as the things are. And this is Marx's notion of ideology. This is where it comes from. And ultimate ideology is, in fact, Christianity. What is furthermore important to note that this need for a subject of theory relieves of these subjects of all properties. It has to be a subject that is absolutely simple and godlike, in fact. And this is for Marx working class. This is why he took working class for it. It has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with observing the real suffering of the industrial working class. It has nothing to do with that. It has all to do with an assumption that you need the self-consciousness that has nothing to lose. That is to say, you need to have self-consciousness that has no ideology because it has really no place in society. It would be like you go to India and you want to liberate India and you take Shudra as a highest caste because they are untouchables. If Marx had Shudras in Germany, he would probably say that Shudras are the ones that will carry the revolution and accomplish the Garden of Eden on earth. This is where it comes from. And nowadays when you have, for instance, these leftists with the hair dyed blue and so on, feminist, trans-feminist, hyper-feminist, fuck this, fuck that, tech feminist, and so on. They're all far cry from this. They're all looking for these victim groups, for instance. This comes from left Hegelianism, from Marxism, and from this anti-theology. The idea that you have to take this main without properties, subject without properties, and then to empower it absolutely, to abolish alienation. And when you hear today some of these more quote-unquote traditional leftists being appalled by this political correctness and so on, because don't be too overexcited about it, because nothing people have now, leftists and radicals, so nowadays have nothing on Marx or Bruno Bauer or Max Stirner or Friedrich Engels. They were far more radical. The very idea of the abolition of private property, that there is no chance one man can be truly free in this world as long as the private property exists, it's so radical and so lunatic that you don't have to invent nothing crazier than that. This is the most craziest thing. This is the craziest thing. And this is very mysterious, very interesting historical phenomena of hypermodernity, of modernity at its peak in continental Europe, where modernity had its own theology. One could argue that Hegel was the epitome of Protestantism, of this modern quasi-religion. I'm sorry, I can't call it any other way, because it is obvious that from this, how it turns into its opposite on a cue. Normal man, a religious man, cannot lose his religion just like that and turn against it. That just don't happen. That was never, what they had was never a religion. It was a sanctifying of attempt to sanctify modernity, and those ideologies that came out of it, those radical economic theories as Marxism and similar, come from this context. In the other sense, in other respects, we have Nietzsche and such people. Nietzsche, who stands above many because he was unique, and his idea of a man was that you have to be unique to create. This is completely other story, but he came from this milieu. He was not, of course, left Hegelians. He was later generation. They were among the worst writers that the world had ever seen. Whereas the Nietzsche was at some points master of language, although he can get irritating. And there is one thing. We'll conclude with this and announce other podcasts on this subject very soon. This is the idea of anti-Semitism that was prevalent among those people, especially in Bauer and Karl Marx, because that famous Marx quotes on Jews that are anti-Semitic, that is in fact conspiratorially anti-Semitic. They are standard Jewish conspiracy slurs, come from his review of Bruno Bauer's booklet, because Marx's little booklet was called On Jewish Question. It is not about the Jewish question per se, but on the book, The Jewish Question by Bruno Bauer. And we will say a few things about that. This is very interesting, very, very interesting subject. And we'll propose maybe some ideas about it. Just to note why Nietzsche, why I say this in context of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was taken as a paragon of fascism by fascists themselves, although even the enemies of Nietzsche and critics of Nietzsche will admit that he was not only he was not anti-Semite, he was philo-Semite. if anything. It is, whereas leftism, that is very rarely accused of something like this, has this at very roots. Hatred, that is to say hatred, critique, radical critique, the pseudonym of Jewishness. And I have some ideas about why this comes to pass. It has to do, of course, with the hatred of Christianity that becomes racial. And we'll talk about it very soon, maybe in our next podcast or podcast after that. Thank you for your attention. This was a bit long, but I hope it was informative and interesting. Branko Malic signing out.